Hello, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and I've continued to read The Lord of the Rings. In this installment, I'm talking about the first 3 chapters of The Return of the King. So we're back to the characters that I think the movies tended to focus on a little bit more, maybe. And it strikes me that while clearly to Tolkien himself and in his narrative, the parts about Frodo and Sam are as important about the parts as the parts about Aragorn and Gandalf and whatever, that in some ways the scenes involving Aragorn, Gandalf, Merry, Pippin, etc., may be a little bit more memorable for your average reader like myself, just because you have more personalities interacting and more clearly defined personalities interacting, right? With Frodo and Sam, it's a lot of Frodo and Sam and Gollum. And, you know, a character like Aragorn or Gandalf was more interesting, and you just don't see them as much. Faramir was very interesting. That was probably most of what I focused on in the last half of the Two Towers. But otherwise, there's, I think, for your, again, kind of plain average guy reader like me, a little bit of a relief maybe in coming back to the chapters about the, I'll go ahead and say it, more interesting characters. For this section, I was definitely always keeping my eye on the map. So many places are referenced before they're described. Of course, it's part of his world building. You know, it wouldn't be very natural if I said, you know, we need to go to Wyoming, the next state north of here, which also is shaped like it's, you know, like if I described it every time that I brought it up, it wouldn't sound natural. So he makes it more naturalistic by not describing things, but it keeps one looking at the map a lot. I thought as Gandalf and you know, here I'm also going to show what a plain average guy reader I am. Is it Merry or Pippin who's with him? It's Pippin. When Gandalf and Pippin are coming closer to Minas Tirith, we hear, for example, quote, "The townlands were rich with wide tilth." It's one of those words he loves. "And many orchards and homesteads there were with oast and garner, fold and byre," etc., etc. Off quote. The sense that there's a lot of agricultural activity going on around Minas Tirith, which makes a lot of sense. Right? In the movie, I don't think we get a lot of picture of how this population is fed. There are some interesting lines in here. You know, again, it's not my focus, just my experience as a regular reader. I'm looking for things I can comment on from an Old Norse linguistics background, but I thought that Gandalf said of Denethor and his love for his son Boromir, quote, "He loved him greatly, too much perhaps, and the more so because they were unlike," off quote. I thought that's actually, you know, it's an interesting, true observation about people. Sometimes I think the parents like the children that remind them less of themselves, and more of an ideal that perhaps the parent failed to fulfill, which seems to be the case with Denethor and Boromir. You know, Tolkien just lovingly describes every aspect of Minas Tirith, all the more strikingly when he reminds us through the mouth of the soldier later that Minas Tirith is but a fortress relative to Osgiliath, or what Osgiliath was before it was overrun. You know, it just makes for actually a compelling description. And of course, the relative humility of the stewards and never assuming the title of king even after centuries is a compelling and interesting part of the narrative when they see this great throne in Minas Tirith, but of course Denethor as steward is sitting in the chair at the base of the steps to the throne. You know, it gives one a sense of nobility, perhaps, in the contemporary sense of people unwilling to take heirs upon themselves. I mean, other than the heir that they already have as stewards. Here's another really archaic word that we see in this chapter, quote, the wild kine of Ra in the far fields of Hrun, off quote. Kine is an archaic plural to cow, right? Just like mouse, mice. Really what we would expect in modern English if we maintain the Old English plural would be cow, kai, but like children and brethren, there is an N inserted somewhere in, I think, the Middle English period. But obviously not something most people say anymore. Of course, 5 comments will tell me that somewhere in England everybody says kine. Okay, but no one I know says kine. It's been interesting the continued remarks people have about my reaction to vocabulary that I think is archaic, that they don't think is archaic. Well, okay. I mean, keep in mind that I could pretty literally say that my profession is archaic vocabulary. But I mean, just stuff that I wouldn't say, right? I may understand it and I may not, because sometimes it's not Old English or Old Norse, it's some obscure Norman or Middle English thing that just is beyond my ken. But I don't go into the general store and talk about kine, right? And that's what I mean by archaic. Not that that it just completely flummoxes me, although sometimes it does. I could say more about some of the stuff, some of the content here, although again, not much of it has to do with language or anything. We have Pippin wondering how much older Gandalf is than Denethor, and I thought, yeah, I wonder that too. That's completely unclear in this narrative. What was Gandalf, off quote? That's a thought that Pippin is having. A thought that I have too, as an average guy reading this, wondering, because it's obviously a lot of hints are dropped that Gandalf is just cosmically old. At which point, I wonder why he's called a wizard. Why not use some other term? But probably wizard is Tolkien translating what the people of Middle Earth refer to him as, right? I assume. And of course, Gandalf hints at this himself when he says, speaking to Denethor, I also am a steward, did you not know? Of course. Right, he's clearly hinting toward his role as something like an angel in the cosmos of Tolkieniana. There's one thing that I thought was interesting world building that the movies really didn't even try to do. Baragon, the soldier, speaking to Pippin, says, quote, I may say that strange accents do not mar fair speech, off quote. So, the movies had an opportunity to make the hobbits have a distinct hobbitish accent and Minas Tirith have a distinct accent, as it does in the books, and the way that these guys, the people of Gondor, talk much more archaically than other people. And I don't feel like they did. Maybe there's some subtle cue that was in the movie that I missed, but I didn't feel like Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin seemed distinctly to be of a place. One translation that did this really well, there's the, I almost said famous, and that would be ridiculous, infamous in certain circles, Nynorsk Norwegian translation of The Lord of the Rings, Ringdrotten, which has the hobbits using the dialect of Ol of Hallingdal. Sam, broader form of it, and Frodo, a more normalized Nynorsk, but rooted in Hallingdal. It has Klug infinitive and some other Midlandsmål, Satterprag, like that, for people interested in Norwegian dialects. That was neat. It would have been neat if the movies had done something similar, made the Hobbit sound, I don't know, Irish or something like that. But I don't think they did that. We have, I sort of noted, Baragon says, quote, it is over late to send for aid when you're already besieged, off quote. Apparently these this over prefix on adjectives and adverb sounds archaic to people. I actually didn't realize that because that's a characteristic of my speech. Maybe that's, I don't know if it's regional or just a weird idiosyncrasy of mine, but struck me that here I complain about archaic language in here, and I do one of these sort of archaic things. We have more about Faramir as the sort of reluctant warrior. Batagon says, quote, "He is bold, more bold than many deem, for in these days men are slow to believe that a captain can be wise and learned in the scrolls of lore and song, as he is, and yet a man of hardihood and swift judgment in the field," off quote. Yeah, not unfamiliar. You know, in our modern day, people also struggle to accept that there might be someone with both, shall we say, you know, manly hardihood or something, or skills with the arms, but also skill with lore or something like that. I think that sometimes people imitate, sometimes people who are one or the other kind of imitate the trappings of being the other more effectively. You don't meet many people who are both, right? As many people probably, you know, put their fedoras on and call themselves warrior poets. I don't think there really are many. And it's striking that Faramir is so distinctly, authentically this type that even other people, sort of strangers, I guess, comment on it. I wondered about this. Quote, "To his face men were gravely courteous, saluting him after the manner of Gondor with bowed head and hands upon the breast," off quote. So they salute like this. I don't know what that's from. I don't know if that's something Tolkien made up or if that's maybe something that people do somewhere, but I thought that it was interesting. I don't think they did that in the movie. Beargill, the kid, complains he doesn't want to be sent away with the maidens. I assume he means girls rather than just unmarried women. So again, pretty archaic use of the word. I noticed that J.R.R. Tolkien does not like using the word wagon, W-A-G-O-N. He likes either wain, W-A-I-N, which is technically the native English word, or wagon with two G's. He doesn't like the normal way people say and spell it. Wagon, by the way, is distinct from wain, is the Norse borrowing in English. But as with many Norse borrowings, it has actually displaced the technically native word as the more normal word, just like they replaced the Old English equivalent of they, or what's another one? Give, displaced Old English yiv, things like that. We see the people of Gondor are using a very archaic counting system. They use 100 and 1,000 as plural nouns. So they talk about, quote, 200s, or, quote, less than 3,000s, off quote, in Old English and Old Norse. And still in our more archaic registers and written remnants of the modern Scandinavian languages in English, that those are used as plural nouns rather than just adjectives. So it's interesting to see that here, clearly deliberate. A note that the people of Gondor eat, quote, day meal, off quote. In Old Norse, the equivalent term, dagmol, is a morning meal, but this seems to be the evening meal here, more like what we call dinner in contemporary America. I guess my grandparents would have called supper, middag in the Scandinavian countries. And finally, I guess minor complaint about writing style. We have Pippin wake up in the middle of the night, hearing Gandalf talking to himself and saying, quote, "When will Faramir return?" off quote. And I thought, who talks to himself that way, right? I don't talk to myself that cogently. If you overheard me talking to myself, you would have no idea what I was talking about, right? Because I'd just be muttering this, that, and the other about, you know, it would just be the tip of the iceberg of what I was actually thinking to myself, right? That's how I think most people talk to themselves. It's just funny to think of someone speaking out loud to oneself that cogently. All right, let me give you a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost, and then I'll talk about chapters 2 and 3. All right, in chapter 2, we flip back to Merry and Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli. We see Merry unhappy because, quote, all he had was a few useful things he had picked up, off quote. I thought that it was interesting to see all used as a singular there. That struck me as being kind of Scandinavian, potentially Old English, but I guess what he's really doing is he's using all as a substitute for a noun, right? It's the totality of what he had, and so he's treating that as singular. I don't think most contemporary English speakers would ever use all singularly. So that was an interesting thing. That may just be a characteristic of J.R.R. Tolkien's somewhat older British English. I don't know. We see that the Rohirrim ride to a weapon take. That's a direct translation of Old Norse våpnatak, the weapon taking. This is, it's exactly what it is here. They're all summoned to a council where they're going to take the weapons, and at least in the Norse context, they would bang their weapons, an indication of assent to things they agreed to in the meeting. Merry rides on a pony named Stubba. That's just Old English for short one. Right? It's related to modern English stubby. This is very different from the movies because this is the first time that elves other than Legolas have shown up since the Fellowship of the Ring, I think. But they don't in the movie, right? In the movie, we get tons of elves in the Two Towers because they all show up to help the Rohirrim at Helm's Deep. But here we just get a couple elves. I think they're sons of Elrond. Yeah. Their names didn't register with me very much at this point. Although this is not Antigua, the land of fairies, wizards, and heroes, it does have a lot of names, and it's fairly difficult to remember everybody's name. But the sons of Elrond. Anyway, I noted that they were, quote, dark-haired, which it occurred to me that in the movies, most elves are portrayed as blonde. I guess not Elrond and Arwen, but I think just about all the other ones. So maybe the weird, like 80s hairband, platinum blonde thing that elves have going on in the movies isn't part of Tolkien's intent. Far be it from me to implicate that the movies are not entirely to Tolkien's vision. There's a place called Dunharrow that would be, so Harrow would be cognate with Old Norse Horkr, Old English Her. This is like altar cairn, a sacred place. So Dunharrow, dark sacred place, or probably actually mountain sacred place, mountain altar. I suppose that's that dune word that's probably borrowed from Celtic that becomes the down word that means hill or mountain in some of the other chapters. I thought that it was interesting that in conversation between Aragorn and another ranger who shows up, Halbarad, Halbarad says, speaking of the hobbits, quote, little do they know of our long labor for the safekeeping of their borders, and yet I grudge it not, off quote. So the hobbits are in NATO, and Halbarad is, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. I don't know. I think that it's interesting that I suppose Tolkien is implicitly acknowledging that the hobbit lifestyle is unsustainable there. Anyway, and then we get another poem Aragorn quotes, and I was surprised to see that this poem, in the middle of a chapter that deals a lot with the Rohirrim, who are so clearly based on Old English language and culture, is in what, from an Old Norse perspective, I would call the Fornir the Slag meter, but it's also the meter of, say, Beowulf or another Old English poem, but isn't from Rohan. Anyway, we get this alliterating pattern: over the land there lies a long shadow, westward reaching wings of darkness. Registers for me is very much Old English or Old Norse in style. Another thing that struck me was the story of the Army of the Dead, which begins with a curse placed upon them by Isildur. He says to the king of the men of the mountains who are going to become the dead, quote, "Thou shalt be the last king, and if the West prove mightier than thy black master, this curse I lay upon thee and thy folk, to rest never until your oath is fulfilled. For this war will last 3 years uncounted, and you shall be summoned once again ere the end." Off quote. I note that words like thou and thy and ear, I tend to hear and perhaps say with a more southern color to my accent than I think I normally have. That probably has to do with the fact that I was used to hearing them from Baptist preachers as a kid. But anyway, the curse is placed upon them not by him waving a magic wand or saying some particular magic words, but just by saying this bad thing is going to happen. That very simple act of just saying something speaks to the superstitious associations with words that medieval people had. This is exactly how we get curses in modern English, like "go to hell," right? That is a curse in its original sense, in the understanding that me saying that might make it happen, right? So, of course, a king has a little bit more power over what might or might not happen than I do. So his saying this makes them survive eternally as the undead until Aragorn comes to summon them. But at any rate, he doesn't have to. He doesn't have. Our understanding of this, I think, is he has to be a 15th level spellcaster, right, and spend all the PPE or all of his spell slots or whatever for that day to do this. But no, in a medieval understanding, I think a king can just say something and it'll happen like that. At least a literary king. Their gate is in Harrowdale. That would again be sort of like Sacred Place or Altar Valley. Aragorn talks to Eowyn, who really doesn't want him to go, and we get the rare male friend zoning, as the kids say. It was kind of interesting in that conversation that she addresses him as thou and thee, and he addresses her as you. So even though he's vastly older, he speaks in a more contemporary way. And or, although I think this would be lost on the modern reader, and I slightly doubt this is Tolkien's intent, he's trying to be more distancing by using a more formal word, but I would think he would use ye and you if that were his understanding rather than just you. There's a place called the Haunted Mountain. The Rohirrim call it Dwemerberg. It's exactly what you'd expect. It's like the ghost hill or something. And then some of the Rohirrim worry about Aragorn and his company being, quote, elvish wights, W-I-G-H-T. Wight, of course, is being a word for any kind of creature. Lots of world building as they go into the cave where the dead are. I thought that the Gimli eye view in the total dark was unexpected and much more colorful than the glowing green skeletons of the movies. They don't really see the dead that they summon. They just have this sort of dark cloud that attends to them. I think that's much more haunting and interesting. And I'm not sure then why when they leave and they're in what is this, Belfalos, or that area of Gondor, people flee because they see the King of the Dead. Well, okay, I guess they see something and Gimli doesn't. And then by the end of that chapter, they're somewhere. I know some of you know the map way better than I do. The fact that I can say the term Belfalos should mildly impress you if you're being generous. I think that they're somewhere around Belfalos, right on the western coast, southwest of Minas Tirith. So now, reading the book, looking at the map in the book, you realize, they actually have a really long way to go. In the movie, it's very vague where things are in relation to one another, and it almost seems like they're right on the doorstep of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. In chapter 3, we return to the Rohirrim and Merry. There's a mountain called Starkhorn. Strong horn. Not very difficult Old English. Speaking of Old English, Merry, listening to the speech of the Rohirrim, thinks, quote, it was a language in which there seemed to be many words that he knew, though spoken more richly and strongly than in the Shire. Yet he could not piece the words together. At times some rider would lift up his clear voice in stirring song, and Merry felt his heart leap, though he did not know what it was about, off quote. well, this is kind of a linguist fantasy that people are going to just love the sound of Old English or whatever. But Theoden, contemplating his potential end on this expedition, says something that reminded me very much of an Old English poem. He says, where is this again? Quote, "If the war is lost, what good will be my hiding in the hills? And if it is won, what grief will it be, even if I fall, spending my last strength?" Off quote. And, immediately what I thought of is the Battle of Malden, that poem in Old English. He shall the hedra, herte the kenra, mode shall the mara, the ure may and litloth. Was that a clear voice and stirring song, folks? You decide. But that, of course, means the mind should be the harder, the heart the keener, the courage the greater as our strength lessens. So very much that same fatalistic but strong acceptance of fate that we see in an Old English or Old Norse attitude. We see another Rohirric leader named, he's Dune Hera, that would be, I suppose, mountain. His name is like Mountain Army. I don't know if that's an attested Old English name, but it seems like it could be. It seems appropriate to where he's from. Everybody brags about Shadowfax and how fast he is, and it makes me think it's an ad for the 1972 Chevy Shadowfax, but I might have borrowed that joke from Riff Tracks. I can't remember now. I've seen the Riff Tracks of these movies a few times. We have a few more Old English place names. Fyrianfeld, that would just mean mountain field. Irin Saga, that would mean iron saw, S-A-W. Interesting because Irin Saga then has the R form of the word iron, which of course is what survives in modern English iron, or Old Norse Jorn. But Isengard, or the river Isen, that's the S form that survives in German, right? Eisen. So I suppose that both variants exist in the Old English language of the Rohirrim. But then I was really surprised. There's these statues around Harrowdale of these ancient people who lived there, and the Rohirrim called them Pukal men. And I thought, should I even look this up? That doesn't even look like an Old English word. But then I thought, this is J.R.R. Tolkien. He surely means something by it. By the way, I don't think that I've looked up previous Old English words. I'm just sort of taking I might have one or two, but I'm mostly kind of taking my firsthand impression of them, because I figure that's what, I mean, not to be arrogant, I have no arrogance about this. I feel like sometimes J.R.R. Tolkien is writing stuff like this for people like me. Like he wants people like me to like blow some air out of our nose in recognition about these words. So I figured that he mostly wants to use Old English as kind of recognizable. Here I thought, there's no way this is even an Old English word. It starts with P. There's not that many Old English words or Old Norse words that start with P. But I looked it up, and it turned out I was really surprised. It does occur in a gloss in an Old English text for Latin faunos. So this would be something like satyr, demon, on the edge of ghost. It is, so I thought, well, where does this come from, right? This still doesn't look like an Old English word to me. Looks like there are some Celtic words that have similar shape. There's Old English puka, which is a little bit more common than this, which might be the source of puck. I'm not sure if I buy that. There's Old Norse puki, which does mean devil, typically in the Christian sense. All of these look like they could be, I think these could be Celtic borrowings in both Old English and Old Norse. I don't know. I mean, that pook word in Dutch that becomes English spook, maybe that's, I can't think of a good Germanic etymology for this. There may be one, but it just doesn't occur to me off the top of my head. Now, how pukal is related to that puka, I don't know. One of the Valiant Anonymous on Wiktionary suggested that it could be related to, pukal could be related to puka, like ladle is to load, or cripple is to creep. But if so, that L suffix that we see in ladle or cripple causes I mutation, and this isn't I mutated, it's not PYCEL. So anyway, that's enough time on that one word, but I thought it was interesting that he dug up such an obscure one. We get another obscure one when we hear that the first man who tried to go through the Pass of the Dead was someone named Baldur. Of course, that is the Old English cognate of the name of the Norse god Baldur, and Old English just means prince or something like that. But thought it was interesting to see him get a sort of a shout out. We get another good Old English word. Eowyn says that she thought that Aragorn was Fey, F-E-Y. Of course, that comes from Old English Faya, F-G-E. Very memorably in a quote in Beowulf, Weird oft nered un fatna thonna his ellendeach. Was that was that like Mary? Did you think that was spoken more richly and strongly than modern English? Anyway, it means luck often saves an undoomed man when his courage holds. So Fey, Old English Faya, Old Norse Fager, which even occurs on such an early source as the runestone, means doomed to die. Right, so he seemed doomed to death to me, potentially accepting his doom to die. And then we get this description of this great cloud that is passing over everyone, making everything dark. I didn't think the movie actually had a big cloud that passed over everything, but maybe it did. I just don't remember that. I feel like I would have remembered that. And it seems like they could have done something with special effects to make that work, but that might be stretching. We have another poem in what I would call, from an Old Norse perspective, for near the Slag, from dark Dunharrow in the dim morning, with Thane and Captain Ruthengil's son. By the way, that Thane word, Thane, most, I would say, American English speakers have probably heard that only in Macbeth. If they're, then Mary uses it, spelling it Thain. It's from Old English Thorn, EGN. It's also Old Norse Thorn, EGN, Thegn, which is a high-ranking retainer to a king. It's also a term of praise used in a lot of Viking Age runestones, where it may not necessarily mean that noble of a figure, but in Old English, I would say it means pretty high-ranking noble figure. I thought it was interesting that Theoden used the word minstrel, which just took me out of the Old English Dark Ages-ish feel of a lot of this. Seemed like kind of an early modern word. Eowyn takes the name Darenhelm in disguise. Of course, that would mean like hide helmet, hidden helmet, something like that, which of course is understandable. She wants to hide her identity beneath her helmet. And then we have a horse named Windfola, so that would be, Windfoal. Makes sense. And it seems like in the book, one of the most memorable scenes in the movie is the lighting of the beacon that in turn watchers at the next beacon light their beacon, and on and on and on, all the way from Minas Tirith to Etheras. In the book, it seems a little bit downplayed. Doesn't seem to be the thing that really gets Theoden's attention. The thing that does get his attention seems to be the messenger who comes from Gondor with the arrow. And in the book, Denethor seems a little bit less reluctant to fight Mordor. Denethor feels fey, right? He feels doomed to die. He doesn't feel like he's doomed to win, but he is trying to fight, and he doesn't have to be tricked into lighting the beacon. I guess Pippin or Merry, I think it's Pippin, whichever hobbit is in Gondor, goes and lights it for him in the movie. But in the book, he's a more responsible ruler in the book than in the movie. Actually, it's true of Theoden, maybe even Aragorn. The movie kind of has, maybe it's an early aughts anxiety about quote-unquote rulers, but I think that it might unnecessarily weaken them as characters in the movie. But again, that's beyond the kind of thing that I'm mostly going for commenting on here. Appreciate you folks staying with me through this. Those were, three chapters that were they held my attention. So hopefully I can say the same for the rest of The Return of the King and on through the appendices. For now, thank you, Patreon, for supporting this channel, and to everyone out there for beautiful Colorado on an inordinately cold and snowy day. I'm wishing you all the best.